All right, well, let's go ahead and begin. We're getting to a quorum of people here, and I know that it's a busy time of the year, especially for a lot of our local government participants. It's budget season for many of you. Welcome. My name is Chris Adams, and I'm the president of Balancing Act, and I'm joined here by Shai Akabas. He's the Economic Policy Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and he'll introduce himself in just a moment. We're delighted that you could join us for this special presentation of an introduction to the newest version of Federal Balancing Act, which is a simulation of the US federal budget that had content developed by Bipartisan Policy Center and the technology and the simulation approach developed by Balancing Act. I'm going to put on our screen just a quick presentation of our missions, and then I'm going to ask Shai to say a little bit more about what he does at Bipartisan Policy Center. Balancing Act is the maker of public budget simulation software that's in use around the world by well over 100 local governments. And our mission is to help bridge that gap between people and government and provide a tool to talk about possibly the most important, one of the most important public policies, the budget, to talk about that in a meaningful and interactive way. Shai, why don't I turn it over to you to introduce yourself and BPC?
Sure, thanks, Chris. My name is Shai Akabas. I direct the Economic Policy Project at BPC and have been at BPC for about 11 years now. We, as Chris said, are sort of more of a do tank than a think tank. We engage a lot with policymakers and stakeholders to develop and advocate for bipartisan policies in a whole host of areas. On our economic policy team, we've worked for a long time on the issues of fiscal policy, debt and deficits that we're here to talk about today. We also do a lot of work on retirement security and Social Security, as well as higher education financing and student outcomes and unemployment insurance and tax policy. So a lot of different areas. And I want to give a quick special shout out to Nico Gladstone on our team and also Dan Ferguson on Chris's team, who are the ones grinding over the last few months to get the content up and running that we're here to present today.
Absolutely. I want to echo that as well to Nico and to Dan Ferguson. Fantastic work to make all this happen. All right. The plan for today is to give a quick overview of the simulation, and then we're going to be using an interactive feature of the simulation that will allow you to go through it on your own after a little bit of contextualization from Shai and make some choices. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and actually in real time, we'll get to look at everybody's aggregated results and have a discussion about it. So that's the plan. Just a quick bit about why a budget simulation. The problem of public engagement on the budget is one that people have been working on for a long time. Governments at the local level, scholars, researchers, and there really isn't that great of a way to do that except for simulations. And it's only been relatively recently that online simulations have become practical. And so we've been working to develop that and to help governments at all levels begin to integrate this into their budget process and also their community engagement strategies. But why a budget simulation works so well is it kind of puts people into the shoes of decision makers, whether it's elected officials or it's professional managers trying to make these tough decisions. So instead of just doing a survey that says, what do you like the most? It actually makes it a little bit more complex and shares some tough trade-offs and encourages people to kind of understand what those are and then to provide their informed input. It's a great way of showing connections between individual choices and the rest of the budget. So the interactivity between various spending items and the revenue items, how revenue is raised and how that's structured can all be presented very well through a simulation. It's a way of conveying constraints, at least for most local governments. You can't spend more money than you have. The federal government doesn't have that constraint, and so we had to do sort of some special work to make this work on the federal level, which I will talk about in a moment. It's that sort of famous duality between the debt and the deficit. By having these online, it means that hundreds of thousands of people can actually do this, and we're very proud. And I think all of us at Balancing Act and Bipartisan Policy Center, one of the things that we're most proud about is that hundreds and thousands of students have actually used Balancing Act in the course of their schoolwork, mostly at the high school level, but also at the college level. And also we've got a group of researchers, about 45 or so, mostly university-based researchers that have been looking at the input that comes in, at the preferences that are expressed and the priorities that people express through Balancing Act. And we're finding that it's actually a very good way of understanding those preferences. At the same time, it's an educational tool And for those entities that are really interested in having very high quality, scientifically valid data, we've got some ways of doing that. And there's actually some peer-reviewed articles that are coming out in the next couple months here that will shed some light on that. So now, Shai, we're going to turn it over to you to sort of give a tour and some of the highlights of Balancing Act before we turn it over to the participants and letting them interact with the budget themselves. So I'm going to pull up a version of the simulation and then let you kind of walk us through it, everywhere from the contextualization to some of the most important areas on the budget.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So, I think one interesting point that Chris brought up, which is really important to emphasize, is that within the simulator, what I think is key is that you are actually forced to sort of put your choices on paper and make sure that they add up. And in a lot of conversations that we get into with people about the federal budget on either side, whether it's Democrats who generally are pressing for more revenues into the budget or Republicans who are pushing to cut spending, a lot of times the proposals come down to things that would barely make a dent in the longer run sustainability picture. And whether that's getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, or cutting down on foreign aid, or on the other side, just taxing the rich more and more, those proposals can certainly make an impact, but in the scheme of things, you need to do a lot more than that. And so part of what this simulation does, I think, fairly effectively, is it helps people understand the magnitude of the challenge and the types of changes that are going to be needed to get us back on a sustainable budgetary course. As Chris said, there's also an extra complicating factor here, because the simplicity of state budgets, albeit a constraint, is that they have to be balanced, and I think most local budgets as well, on an annual basis. The federal budget does not have that constraint, especially as we've seen recently in the current crisis. And it's a good thing it doesn't have that constraint, because there are periods where the federal government really does need to spend significantly more than it takes in. This is one of those periods, but at some point we need to get back to a place where the budget is on a sustainable course. So let me briefly explain. Well, Chris, where should I start? Do you want me to go through? Did you want to play the video from Conrad and Kasich, or you're on mute, Chris?
Yep. Sorry, I wasn't going to play the video. Sometimes it doesn't show up that well on Zoom, and I think you've actually given a good overview of what Kasich and Conrad were going to say. I would start with just these top two indicators, and just kind of talk a little bit about what those are, and especially how this one is calculated.
Sure. So we've started here with the 2022 federal budget, and the fiscal year 2022 for the federal government starts on October 1 of this year. So it's really the budget that the members of Congress and the administration are planning right now. The president is actually shortly going to submit his budget proposal for the coming year. I think he's going to put out what they're calling a skinny budget or something along those lines this week, and then the full budget will be coming in the next month or two. But the people who work on appropriations, which is the annually allocated spending, they're going to be doing their work in the coming months. So this is putting users of the simulation in the shoes of policymakers that are planning for the coming year. Now, you see that the deficit in fiscal year 22 is $1.1 trillion, or it's projected to be. That is significantly less than the deficit was this past year and this current year, when the deficit got as high as $3 trillion. I think the projections for this year are around $2 trillion. So it's coming back down as we get the current crisis in the rearview window. But if we look at deficits over time, and I think one of the graphs that Chris was just pulling up show this, those deficits will begin to rise again fairly quickly over the coming years, and they become unsustainable. So what we've done here is you have a metric like all of the local and state versions of Balancing Act, where you're showing the current year deficit, which is important to show what the amount of money that's coming in is relative to the amount that's being spent out. But I think the more important metric to look at as you're going through the simulation and figuring out what policy choices you want to make is the long-term outlook, the sustainability metric, which tries to show on a 25-year basis how the balance of revenues and spending is looking relative to a position of sustainability. Sustainability in the long run balance of the federal budget means that you have your economy growing as fast or faster than your debt is growing. So it's not that we can't have a penny more in debt in 25 years than we have today. It's we want to make sure that our debt is not continuously increasing at a rate that's faster than the economy is growing, because at some point that causes problems, whether it's less investment and less growth, economic growth on a national level for the country, whether it's a concern among investors that the US is not going to be able to repay all of its debts in a worst case scenario, or just an increase in interest rates to reflect the fact that there's a little less certainty about that. Any of those are possibilities that could arise in the future if we don't get a hold of our fiscal house. So what this metric is trying to do is show the types of changes that need to be made now that have an effect all the way in the future. And some of these changes go into effect slowly over time, and we'll get into that in a moment. But what we're trying to show is how significant the changes need to be in order to get us to a sustainable place 25 years from now. So what that specifically measures is the budget deficit as a percentage of the economy in the 25th year, so in 2047. Now, understanding exactly what that means is not critical, but it gives you a sense of what we're trying to measure here. We're trying to make sure that not only is the deficit in this year, whatever you think is appropriate for the federal government, but in that 25th year, which shows what course we're on over the long term, are we in a place where the debt and the economy are growing at, the debt is growing at a similar or a slower pace than the economy is growing. So that's what we're trying to measure as a whole. And then jumping down here into a few of the categories, you'll see that we've tried to, the federal budget is extremely complex and has thousands of programs in it. So what we've tried to do here is group them into understandable categories that are meaningful to the average person and the average user. That will combine certain elements of what is called discretionary spending or annually appropriated spending, and mandatory spending, which are programs that continue running on autopilot until a change is made. So think of Medicare, Social Security, those are the types of things that fall into the latter category, whereas research and development or spending on a lot of housing assistance or higher education, national parks, all of those things would fall in the discretionary budget, as well as dozens and dozens of other examples. So when you look at the pie chart, Chris, just drawing attention to that at the top, you'll see that there's a few categories that make up the vast majority of federal spending. Healthcare and Social Security together actually make up more than half of the federal budget. Healthcare includes Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, Affordable Care Act subsidies that are provided to people for health insurance, as well as some smaller categories of research. And then and children's health insurance, I should mention. And then Social Security, as everyone knows, is the major old age and retirement program, as well as the disability insurance program. But then after you get through those two categories, you have defense, which is the third biggest category there. And then interestingly, the fourth biggest is interest that we pay on the federal debt. And I want to emphasize that one because it's less relevant for your purposes. We've locked it because it's not something that can be changed by the user. It's not something that Congress can legislate away. But it is critical because that is the element that is the fastest growing in the coming years. And so what you are doing essentially by making choices in this simulation, and policymakers making choices on the federal budget, whether it's taxes or spending, they're making decisions that will ultimately curb the growth of that interest over time as both our debt grows and as interest rates presumably rise from their current lows. It's unclear exactly how far they'll rise, but at some point interest is expected, possibly in the next decade or so, to exceed the amount that we're paying on defense. So it'll become the third biggest category in all of these categories that we're presenting in the federal budget. And the only way to really offset that in future years is to make changes now or in the coming years that reduce the amount of debt that we have as an economy. So back into the categories here, then you see the revenue bar below that shows how much we're taking in revenues. And the difference between those two is the deficit number that you see above the $1.1 trillion. So when we look at the categories, I guess, Chris, just what you were doing before, I'm sorry to take you back. We can start on the tax side. Individual income taxes, this represents about half of all of the money that the federal government takes in every year. And the way that we've done this, I think, is pretty interesting and intuitive to the user, which is we've not looked at the tax code and looked at each of the marginal tax rates, which is how much you pay on the income that you have between 200 and 400,000 or between 50,000 and 100,000. What we've done is we've said, here are 5 groups of taxpayers. Chris, we have 5 or 6. I can't remember if we took out the top.
We have 6.
6 groups, sorry, because we've isolated the top 1% there. So we have 6 groups. We have the top 1%, and then we have the rest of the top 20%. And then we have each of the quintiles, the groups of 1/5 of all taxpayers below there. So you see how much those groups are paying in effective tax rates. So the top there is paying a 23.4% effective tax on their income for federal income tax purposes, and that sums to $822 billion. So even though that's just 1% of the tax-paying population, they are paying almost as much as the next 19%, and then more, significantly more than each of the other 4 quintiles. And that's how it should be. People who pay more, that's what you have in a progressive tax system. But it shows how much more they are paying. So clearly, in order to get more revenue, you need to be getting, in order to collect more, significantly more revenue, we need to make changes to those top few categories, because that's where most of the revenue comes from. Changing how much we're collecting or the effective tax rate of the lowest income is certainly a policy debate that we should have in terms of how much they should pay in taxes. And in fact, you see that they pay a negative effective rate because they get more in credits than they, on average, than they have to pay in net taxes. But the real changes that are going to make a significant dent are more likely to be at the higher end, because those are where most of the income tax revenues come from for the federal government. This is true for all of the categories, but if you want to read more about either how we've calculated the category, what it's measuring, or just more information and context as you're making these decisions, those blue icons, those eyes, whether it's on the top category like individual income tax, or in the subcategories on high income, upper middle income, low income, those will tell you a little bit more detail about what you're looking at there. And then sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to say that just to point out to folks that when you make changes to especially to certain items on the simulation, it impacts both the deficit, but it also impacts the percentage towards sustainability. So there's basically kind of 2 math problems that are being done with some of these items. Some of them impact the debt more than the deficit, and some do the deficit more than the debt. But just to point that out, and we'll give you an example of this on the spending side as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's great. And you can see as Chris is moving the top 1% right there, that can make a significant dent because those people have a lot of income. It's worth noting that they already have a high effective rate, and this is not including the taxes that they pay either on payroll taxes, state income taxes, capital gain, other taxes that they incur. So their actual effective tax rate on all taxes is significantly higher than the 20, I forget what it was there, but 23.4% that is shown originally. Chris, maybe we should move over to the spending side and do a couple categories there, and maybe we can look at healthcare and Social Security as examples. And those are definitely a good example of what Chris was just talking about, where what we've done in the programming here is to reflect the fact that changes in entitlement programs, especially that are made now, will have a much more impact in later years than they will this year. We've shown that in the outputs in the simulators. So you'll make changes in Medicare premiums or in cost control that only have a relatively modest effect now. But when you look at the longer term in terms of how much it's saving the federal government because of the fact that it bends the curve for cost growth in healthcare, those will have a much bigger effect over time. So you can see that I think we have these changes having no impact on the current year, because these are changes like changing how medicine is paid for, bundling payments where you're not paying as a fee-for-service model, but you're paying to have some type of, to make your ailing knee better, as opposed to paying for each doctor you see and each x-ray you get and each procedure you get. And that change, or the changes in the rates of how much we're compensating medical providers, or changes in other types of delivery mechanisms, drug pricing, all of those are changes that can have a significant effect on healthcare spending over time, but they wouldn't do a whole lot in the current year that we're in right now. So the way that we've scored that, per se, or the way that we're reflecting that, is trying to show that reality. And then if we go to Social Security, you see another example of that. And here, as Chris is scrolling through, there's a lot of other examples on health spending there. But on Social Security, we've split this into a couple different options. We have average Social Security retirement benefits, which is the old age and survivors insurance program. That's the OASI part of the Social Security program. And then you have Social Security disability benefits down below. And those are 2 different programs that people become eligible for when they've met the thresholds, which is for retirement benefits, it's having to work for 10 years at a certain level of income. Disability, you become eligible sooner than that, but you have to have a work record in order to be eligible for disability benefits. And then the third element that you can change there is the full retirement age, which is a pretty easily understandable reform to make on the policy side. And these increases are not increasing the earliest age that you can get benefits, which is currently 62, but the full retirement age, which is when you're eligible for your what is called a full Social Security benefit. Now you can actually get increased Social Security benefits up to age 70 right now, so it's a little bit of a misnomer what full benefit means, but it means sort of the standard retirement age or the amount that you would get from the benefit formula without modifications for retiring early or waiting later to collect your benefit. So those are the changes that you're able to make here, and you'll see that things like the retirement age and Social Security benefit levels will also have a much bigger impact on the long run than they will in the short run. It's critical to realize, and anyone who plays around with this a little bit will do so fairly quickly, that to get to a place of sustainability, you'll have to make changes in some of the big tax categories and these entitlement programs. And that's part of what I was getting at the beginning, where if you just fiddle around with foreign aid and other small discretionary programs, or a little bit on the tax side here and there, raising the gas tax a little or corporate income taxes, those will help, but they're not going to get us anywhere near to a place of sustainability in the long run. And it's these bigger categories up top that we were just looking at that will bear the significant load of those changes. Now, they can happen more on the tax side than on the spending side. That's not to bias anybody in terms of where those decisions are made. They can happen primarily on the tax side, or they can happen primarily on the spending side, but you're going to have to fiddle with some of those larger categories in order to get to a place of sustainability.
Yeah, I think that's great. Anything else, Shai, that would be useful for these folks before we kind of cut them loose to try it out a little bit on their own?
No, I think those are the high points. There's a lot in here, and I would definitely encourage people, as I said before, to click on those blue icons, because that's really how you make an informed decision about these categories, which if you just look at the top line or the title of the category, you're not getting much information about what it does and what some of the considerations are for increasing or decreasing that type of spending or tax. Mm-hmm. But if you go to those more information, there's charts and links and more text information that can help you make those decisions.
Yeah, it actually, I think, take a couple hours probably to go through and read everything, and even just to nominally explore some of the links. It's a really rich tool that allows you to sort of drill down on those items that you want to learn more about. And once again, great job on the content to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I want to show you now, by the way, and you might have seen this before, that if you reach sustainability, you will get confetti. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just by raising this. But it starts to change colors to orange, goes from red to orange, and then I think it goes to maybe yellow, or does it go straight to green? I think it goes straight to green. And then I think I already did my confetti on this, so it doesn't give you confetti twice. But let's go back to the PowerPoint. I just want to sort of describe what we're going to do now. So this is a room full of people. It's about 400 people, and this is obviously pre-pandemic. And in this instance, they're going through a budget together. And in this meeting design, each table has one laptop, and they're having a discussion about what they would like to see and what values are important in order to make a decision about what they'd like to select on the simulation. And they're using a special URL that registers their responses on what we call the facilitator screen, and that's what's shown here. And we're going to be doing the same thing today with you all, but obviously on Zoom. And I'm going to give you just a very brief tutorial on how to do it, and then we're going to give you about 10 minutes or so for you to go through and make some of these selections on your own. And then we'll come back and look at the aggregated results from what everybody's done on this meeting, and just have a little bit more discussion with Shai and so forth. This is just another example. Everyone in this instance has their own device, kind of just a different way of thinking about it. This is actually from the city of Tacoma, Washington. This is the guy who created the simulation. He's a senior budget analyst, and this is the budget director for the city, and this is the director of strategic planning. And what they're doing is, if you can see behind the play sign here, that's where the results come in. And these guys are actually commenting on it and just sort of saying, why things, are proposed the way they are, and what some implications and some changes might have been. And this was actually all introduced by the city manager of Tacoma. It was actually a really interesting process that they did. So now it's your turn. So I'm gonna, the key thing to remember is you probably saw at the bottom of each category, there's a there's an item that says submit category. So that's something different when we're using meeting mode versus just the regular online version, is that when you're doing meeting mode, you actually have to submit the category. And that's so that we can then add it to the facilitator screen to show everybody in real time. And so it's very simple. You just click on the submit category, and then you'll get a green check mark that tells you you've done it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and I just show you how that works. So when you're here, you make your selections and so forth, and then just hit submit, and you get a green check mark. So I'm going to go ahead and drop into chat right now the URL. This is actually it. Let's see.
Chris, while
everybody, yeah, please.
While you're doing that, just one more point to emphasize, because I realized as you were clicking through that top 1% line that in and of itself can get you to a sustainability, to a point that's considered sustainable. One thing to emphasize here is that we did not build in what are called dynamic effects to these changes, and that really comes into play when you make significant changes that try to solve the entire problem with one of these categories. So you can presumably confiscate all of the top 1%'s money and put that towards deficit reduction, which is something close to what Chris would have done, even though the effective rate says 44%. If you add that up with all the other taxes that the top 1% pays, that would probably take about all of their money. So that's plausible to do, but the economic effects of that would likely be somewhat severe in terms of cutting off investment in the economy and all types of other ramifications. So it's likely that that would not get us to a place of sustainability in reality. The simulator doesn't quite, so what I guess I'm saying is the simulator doesn't quite reflect all the ramifications that some of those decisions might make, but it's important to consider them when you're making those choices.
Yeah, good. Okay, so in chat, I've gone ahead and put a link. So that's a link to the public view or the participant view. Go ahead and open that up, and maybe just spend 10 minutes or so just kind of going through, making some selections. Hit that submit button at the bottom, and then we'll come back as a full group and just discuss it a little bit, and hopefully give you all a chance to ask some questions, both about the setup of the simulation, content items, anything that you want to talk about, or make a comment on. So go ahead and take about 10 minutes. If you're having any trouble, put something in chat or ask a question, and we'll see if we can help. All right. So see if you can wrap up at least this initial attempt at working through the simulation. And if you can, you should be looking at my facilitator screen right now, which is where we see the results. While you're disentangling yourself from the simulation and coming back, Shai, we had a couple of questions. One is from Janet Anderson, and she asks, for learning objectives, it sounds like sustainability is your focus. Do you recommend we start with one thing we want everyone to learn?
It's a great question. I think the first thing that comes easily when you open the simulator up is just how many different programs and revenue sources are in the federal budget. So when even folks like myself who work on budget issues routinely, we can't be familiar with every single program that's in there. I'm sure there's a few people who work at like the Office of Management and Budget, stuff like that, but it's just so complex and it reaches into so many different areas of society. And I think the simulator helps students or whoever's using it think through the different kinds of programs that the federal government has and the different purposes that they serve. And then the second part is probably related to that, which is that to get to a place where we're sustainable, you really do need to think about changes to a variety of those programs. And as we were talking, as you all were working on making selections, I was actually thinking about the fact that we should make that perhaps reflected even a little bit more in some of the categories, so that, for example, there's no way to realistically that we could get to a place of sustainability by raising taxes on the top 1%. And so reflecting that perhaps a little bit more on the back end in the simulator, because there's no way that we could collect twice as much or 3 times as much money as we're collecting from the top 1% today. They would make decisions that would make it so that the government didn't collect that money. Like they would shelter it in certain places. They would have less income to begin with if it was all being taken. So there are types of things that need to be thought about in terms of how much we can actually get out of individual categories. But I think broadly speaking, aside from that exception, you can see that when you're making changes to a lot of the spending categories and even some of the other tax categories, that they'll all make a dent in the bottom line. But you need to make a series of changes to a variety of different programs in order to get to where you're trying to go.
That's a great question. And Janet, originally, when you asked your question, I was wondering if you might, we have a couple of teachers on, and as I said, we love it when teachers use this. I did want to point out that PBS NewsHour has actually created a lesson plan for teachers to use this in the classroom and tied it to national standards and so forth. And that's nice. But now that I see, my colleague just pointed out, they're actually from the city of Detroit. So that probably wasn't the first behind your question. We had another question about the option to remove the cap on SSI tax for high earners. And I want to say a little bit about that, Shai? And I think Nico says we do.
Yeah, can you scroll down to there, Chris, just so I can remind myself what we've got in that category? Yes, so if you look there, we do have eliminate the taxable maximum. So that would affect it, and that fixes a good, a solid chunk of the program. It would fix even more than that portion of the Social Security problem in and of itself, in the sense that the trust fund's reserves are expected to, as many of the folks on this call probably know, are expected to be depleted in about 10 years from now. And so eliminating the cap on Social Security payroll taxes would fix, I forget the exact percentages, but something more than half of that program over the window that the trustees usually use to look at that. And here they would make a significant dent on sustainability. But it's important to think about the fact that, when you're eliminating that cap, then you're also raising effective tax rates on the same people that you might be increasing individual income taxes on for the top 1%. So there's only so many times you can go back to the same well, even though the way that this simulator is not making the interaction of all of these categories, it's not producing estimates that take into account the interaction of all of them. So you could eliminate the cap and increase the tax rate on Social Security taxes and raise the effective tax rate on the high income folks to 40% or something, and that would fix the problem on the simulator. But in reality, as I said before, there's no way that you can collect that. There's something called the Laffer Curve, which some folks on here are probably familiar with, and it's used in jokes sometimes to, because people sometimes say, well, if you raise taxes, then you'll get less revenue. That's not true at the place that we're at today. But what is true is that you get declining returns from increasing tax rates after you get to a certain point, because either people will do different things with the money, or the money won't be there in the first place. If you're effectively confiscating it all for the federal government, there will be less investment. There will be other things that change those dynamics that aren't able to be reflected in a relatively straightforward simulator like we have here. But in the real economy, it would have those effects. And so, again, important to think through that. We've tried to tease out a couple of those in the more information boxes, but we're trying to give people as many options as we can in terms of how they can adjust taxes.
No, that's great, Shai. Let's take a look at what people selected, and maybe you can have a little commentary on that, Shai. But this is great. We've had so many people asking questions through chat. Please keep them coming, and let's kind of go through this together. So it looks like first I do want to point out that the results screen, the facilitator view, does not show the sustainability metric, and that's one thing we might want to try to build in at some point. But right now we're just kind of focused on what the impact of the deficit was. But as you went through this individually, you should have been able to see what your own choices would do to the debt. Well, let's take a look at healthcare, and it looks like the cost containment was no additional cost control by 4 users, moderate by 5, aggressive by 6. And overall, this category was decreased by $2.4 billion. That's the average for this kind of bundled question. And then it looks like people increased the federal portion of Medicaid fairly markedly, or at least 7 people did. I guess maybe not that much, for a net increase of $2.1 billion. Affordable Care Act subsidies also went up $3 billion, with 6 people increasing, 4 people decreasing. And then health research and education training, CHIP, CDC. I'm not surprised that CDC got a pretty good bump, given that we're coming out of a pandemic. FDA and so forth. Shai, what does this tell you in terms? How would you interpret this? I mean, this is kind of these two, Medicaid and federal portion of Medicaid and Medicare are the 2 biggies. How does that strike you?
Well, it's interesting that these changes are actually very small in the scheme of things, and I think that reflects the fact that people feel like even small changes are having a big impact potentially in terms of the effect that they would have. It is very difficult to rein in Medicare and Medicaid spending, and that's why it's not done all that often. That's why healthcare costs are a big part of our budgetary challenge, and they impact everybody from providers to patient to taxpayers and patients, and so it's difficult to think through all the ramifications of that. But it is interesting, and I think it's right that we will need to cut down on healthcare spending. It's interesting that Medicaid went up, and I think that's actually what's happening right now is that the federal government is paying a larger share of Medicaid than normal with the states to reflect the fact that, or to offset the fact that the states are going through in some cases, such difficult budgetary challenges with the pandemic.
Right. I'm going to take a couple of a comment and then a couple of questions, Shai. So Janet from the city of Detroit would ask a question about sustainability. Says very interesting conceptual exercise. For example, Detroit is in a highly fragmented metro area. Many services people are interested in are delivered by our county, school jurisdiction authorities, et cetera. That may be a good one for us to highlight. So I think that is useful to think about how various governmental services wrap around together. And I see that we have some people from Syracuse City School District on. Syracuse is actually an entity where they is a place where 4 different levels of government or 3 different levels of government use balancing act. The school district is kind of the lead in that, the city of Syracuse, and then the transit association in Syracuse as well. So looking at those overlapping services can be really interesting, Janet. And then Kiki Turner from the city of Denver asks, how did you determine the increases or decreases associated with the multiple choice questions, particularly those questions that were broader? For example, the phased-in cost containment question offers a moderate cost control option, resulting in a $2.4 billion decrease. How did you determine the $2.4 billion?
That's a great question. So we based that moderate cost control off of a package of proposals to modify Medicare that was made several years ago that we would sort of deem to be a moderate cost control package. And so this was the estimate of how much it would save. What's important, though, to your question, 2.4 in the scheme of 780 is extremely small, but this is one of the categories where the much bigger impact would be on the sustainability. I don't remember exactly what that would produce alone by itself, but it would be more than the 0.3% that is reflected in there. So you can see it's about 5 percentage points on the sustainability metrics. So
right.
That's one of those policies that's phased in over time. And so as we go forward, healthcare costs, the cost curve as it's called, is bent more.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to go back to the facilitator screen. The facilitator screen, in case you haven't learned, it's got the kind of powder blue background to distinguish it from the input screen. And then federal portion of Medicaid, once again, increased, but really not resulting in that much money, $2.1 billion. Let's go to Social Security and see what people did there. So it looks like 6 people left current law in terms of retirement age. 5 increased it to either 68 or 69, and then overall the category was increased by really not that much, 888 million. I know it sounds like a lot, but really not that much overall. Comments on that, Shai?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it would be even more interesting to see the distribution there and see, well, it looks like benefits were unchanged by 8 users. So it appears that people did not want to tinker around too much with Social Security benefits. And that's the approach that Congress has taken over the last 20 or 30 years. So you're in good company there, folks who do not do that. But one important consideration here is that Social Security, and we explained this a little bit more in the information boxes, but Social Security is experiencing some financial pressures of its own, as I mentioned before, that if changes aren't made to the program, then there would be an across-the-board cut in benefits of about 25% in just about 10 years from now. And so major changes will need to be made. They obviously could be made on the tax side, and there are proposals in Congress that would do the entire thing on the tax side, which would be a pretty significant tax increase. Then this is the other side of things. So if you're not going to reduce benefits, then basically you're going to need to increase revenues into the program.
Mm-hmm. And then let's take a quick look at defense. So it looks like defense, military decreased moderate amount, 8.4 billion. hardware and major purposes that purchases that got a pretty significant decrease relative to its size at 27 billion. R&D, a little bit of a decrease. Nuclear weapons, really not too much, 408 million. Quick comments on defense, Shai?
Defense is a common area for proposals to reduce spending. There's a few challenges there. One is, of course, we're talking about national security, so it's a very important element of the budget, and there's a strong industry that lobbies for keeping that spending there. But what I will also say is that reducing costs in the Department of Defense tends to come back to how you can make spending more efficient and sort of put in place cost controls that change the way that the military spends money, because ultimately there are certain elements of our national security that we just need. We need to buy, planes and ships and pay our soldiers and everything along with those lines. But when it comes to procurement and when it comes to how we're doing various spending on operations, those are the types of things that if we make our contracts more efficiently and we change our processes, that over time that could save significant money. But figuring out exactly how to do that and operationalize it has been very difficult for the military in the past, which is why the budgets have continued to increase. So it's not as simple as just saying, we're going to cut this program off, because you're not just going to stop making ships to defend the country, but it's a process of making sure that we're procuring what we need for the military in a more efficient way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's look at the revenue side. And it looks like by a 10-to-1 ratio, folks increased taxes on the top 1% fairly significantly for 182 billion. I think that I think we can see now how they worked on significantly reducing the current deficit. High income raised tax rate to 12.45% and raised 225 billion. 44 billion on that upper middle income. Middle income increased by about 12 billion. Lower middle income raised what they would pay, 14.6, and then low income went up by 11 billion as well. Shai, what do you think about that in terms of a progressive income tax structure?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised that a lot of the changes were done on the tax side here. What I think is particularly interesting is that in the lower income categories right now, Congress is talking about actually reducing the effective amount that a lot of those households pay. When you've heard about things like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit and the child independent care tax credit that helps offset childcare costs, all of those are credits that are flowing through the tax code that actually, if they're continued like they were in the recent rescue plan that passed, they're going to make these rates significantly lower. And people are in this in the way that we presented it here, calling for those households to pay more in income taxes. So I'm skeptical that that's going to be something that's on the table anytime soon, because these are people that are making minimum wage, especially in that low income category, even the lower middle income category. But I think it's a reflection of the fact that people want this problem to be solved mostly on the tax side, which is doable to some extent, but it's worth considering some of the ramifications here. So if you do collect, or if you make those rates less negative on the lowest income or lower moderate income, that's removing some income support that we are providing to those families right now that are making at the bottom end, or that have wages at the bottom end of the income distribution. Those are some of the families that are either in poverty or close to poverty. So likely changes that would be difficult for policymakers to choose.
And really counter to the direction of the American Rescue Plan that was just implemented.
Right.
Interesting.
And I think that partially goes to the fact that this is complicated here. We're not itemizing all of the tax credits and itemizing marginal tax rates so people can sort of spell this out for themselves. But it is important to recognize that people in these groups are effectively getting support through the federal income tax system, not paying net taxes. And so if we reduce that support, it's effectively akin to reducing spending on those populations through things like food stamps or other programs that actually do operate through the spending side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's take a look at the payroll tax.
So that went up a lot, which will help Social Security's finances and of course contribute to the overall sustainability as well. And again, it's important to think through the fact that and a lot of users chose to eliminate the taxable maximum. when you eliminate the maximum and you raise the rate and you raise rates on the highest income, we're talking about marginal rates, meaning on the additional marginal dollar that high income people would earn. Those could be getting up certainly above 60%, maybe 70%, depending on exactly where these levels are. So we're taking a very significant portion of additional earnings at the high income level. And again, going back to a point I made earlier, that will likely mean that those people are going to be earning less money, which means in turn that we're going to be collecting less from the government by doing so. Not collecting less than if we did nothing, but collecting less than we would expect to, all else equals. So it's worth thinking about that, as well as perhaps the ramifications for economic growth if you're taxing incomes at such high levels that people may just think it's not worth spending as much time earning them, or it's worth spending a lot more money to try to shelter your income than it is to reveal it to the federal government. And then we have to put more money into the IRS to cut down on tax evasion. So there's a lot of different consequences here that are not all able to be reflected in the model, but it is interesting to see how people are thinking about this conceptually.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I think we're getting towards the end of our time, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint. And I would invite anybody else who has any comments or questions to go ahead and put those into chat. Other than that, I guess I could have had this up. Other than that, Shai, this is one of my favorite pictures. This is actually at the the City of Hartford Public Library, and it's a teacher with a bunch of students going through the budget for that city. And I just really like this picture. And as I said, we are getting a lot of classes that are using it. We hope that more and more local governments and Shai, we hope to do some things on the federal budget with you using this approach as well. But any last comments?
No, this is really interesting to work through this with a group of folks who are at the state and local level, and looking forward to being able to share this with more people and continuing to tinker and improve on it as we go along.
Yeah, that's great. We did a soft launch of this new version about I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks ago, and we've had I think about 17 or 18,000 users spending I think around 18 minutes on site. So I remember having a conversation with a budget director for the state of Colorado where he said if I could just get residents to spend 10 minutes learning about the trade-offs and what's going on and then the relationship between spending and revenue with the state of Colorado, the governor and I could have a completely different conversation with residents. And I think the same is true about this for the federal level. If we could get more and more people to spend 10, 15, 20 minutes sort of learning about these trade-offs, I think that we could really have a different type of conversation. Shai, thank you to you and to your team, and especially to Nico. And on our side, Brendan Morrison really helped conceptualize a lot of this, and Dan Ferguson did all of the development work. So thank you, everyone who helped build this, and thank you for all of you who helped who worked through this with us today. Please help spread the word. It's a free resource. It's available, and we'd love to have as many people as possible use it. So thank you, everyone. Take care.